Good evening and welcome to the Philosophical Research Society. My name is Art Johnson. I'm a staff member here at the Society, and I was asked to introduce a series in 12 parts on the Kabbalah starting this evening. Eliphas Levi, the master Kabbalist, magus, poet, philosopher, essayist of the 19th century, who almost single-handedly started the occult revival from France northward into England, stated in one of his later essays under the collective title of The Great Secret, that the secret to magic, basically, pulling the veil aside, is balance, equilibrium. That the magus or magician tunes himself like a pitchfork, rather a tuning fork, to the same pitch as the elements. And by doing this, passes in and out of these energy sources. I thought of that driving over here tonight and thought it to be quite applicable to Ron Hogarth. I have taped over 300 lectures here in the past 3 years of Mr. Hall's and guest lecturers, so I've listened to a lot of lectures. And a good lecturer to me has the balance, has that quality. In one hand practical, in the other hand mystical, in one hand analytical, and the other hand intuitive. Combining these elements gives you magic. And without any further ado, Ron Hogarth.
Hello. Lovely formal introduction, not the kind that we usually have here, so don't get used to them. That's the only one you're going to get this series. And it was only because my arm was wrenched behind my back. I do want to announce, first of all, that since it said in the program that both Art and I were poets, we're going to bore you with one poem each at the beginning of the second half of the lecture. And I'll warn you in advance that the essence of the lecture will be included in the poems. Now, on a serious note to begin with, I want to issue a kind of warning. First, I want to explain where my perspective is coming from and precisely what my subject matter is, and then I want to give you a warning about that subject matter. What you'll be getting from me here is a kind of artist's and mystic's perspective on the Kabbalah. I am not interested in the theoretical aspects of it, although you will be bombarded with it, I guarantee you. Only so far, though, as it serves to promote creativity, self-understanding, in other words, so long as it's practical, so you can make use of it. If you have the entire tree of life and all the different permutations of the Hebrew alphabet completely memorized, my congratulations. You've probably undoubtedly discovered that it hasn't done much for your personal life. The reason is you have to make these things work for you. You have to understand them in terms of your own experience, otherwise they're useless. And so that's what we're going to try to do here. Now, the second part of this warning is that what I am using as material all originates from the Hebrew Kabbalah, and that will be what I'm focusing on. And that gives us an immediate problem. And the problem is that most of the material on the Hebrew Kabbalah is spurious. It's little bits and pieces that have gotten away from the oral transmission, that has been written down and has been interpreted without very much guidance from the actual Hebrew Kabbalists involved. It's only been very recently, in fact, that we have one writing commentator who is undoubtedly a member of the Kabbalistic school. There's others who may be, but it's hard to tell. Most of the material that you will run into under the name of Kabbalah, purporting to be Hebrew Kabbalah, is built out of the work of such people as MacGregor Mathers, a little bit of Yeats actually, Westcott, European occultists who had some contact with adepts in the Hebrew tradition, had some access to materials that were published, but the great warning, of course, here is that even in those materials, certain things are left out. Certain things are made confusing. For instance, there is a tremendous amount of humor in the Kabbalah, and if you don't have a good sense of humor and you read the Kabbalah, you get very confused because they say contradictory things, and all they're trying to do is poke fun at you. And they figure that if you don't get the fact that they're poking fun at you, you don't deserve to understand it anyway. So what you're getting then is the interpretation of a person who has taken as much as he could find of the Kabbalah, sifted through it as critically as possible, and has compared it to other major mystical and religious traditions and personal experience. That's as far as I can go. If anybody tells you that they are teaching you the Hebrew Kabbalah, this is the secret doctrine released through the tribes of Israel, they are lying to you. And I'll tell you why. I don't see anyone here who is over 40 and an Orthodox Jew. And if you're not those two things, you're not going to get the Hebrew Kabbalah. We can make some good guesses at what it is, and I can point out at the start that it is a really wonderful system, even if we only have fragments of it. The few fragments that we have are very useful. And beyond that, since it is my belief, and perhaps one of the few tenets held by this society, that at the heart, at the core of all religion, there is one truth, it is possible to glimpse through what we have of the Kabbalah and make a pretty good guess as to what it's actually trying to say. It's especially helpful to compare it to the period when it was produced and to get a sense of how these people thought. An example that often leads to misinterpretations of the Bible is that the Hebrews of the era when the Bible was written down first had a tendency to exaggerate, like most Semitic people of that period. This is not to say that they were liars. This is to say that they loved metaphor. If they wanted to describe something to you, they described it big. And of course, now people come along and read these big metaphors literally and get extremely confused. Another problem is that the Hebrew Kabbalists, who had their hands on the Bible all the time, loved the most subtle, irritating little games with words and numbers and all sorts of little permutations, and there are probably a dozen messages in every section of the Bible that nobody but somebody very well versed in Hebrew and in Kabbalistic lore can figure out, because they'll take things like the first 5 letters of the Bible and give you an entire doctrine of metaphysics based on those 5 letters. Names have dozens of meanings. Number, letter, what they sound like, all sorts of associations like that. So what we're dealing with is a very rich, very confusing system. In the introduction to it, it was described as a golden key, at least in the, what the hell do you call that thing? In the program that you all got. And that golden key, that wording is there because the Kabbalah, in my experience, has been a tremendous tool. There have only been a couple that I have found to be tremendously useful in any system. In other words, you can take the Kabbalah and apply it into Tibetan Buddhism and have a greater understanding of Tibetan Buddhism. Very useful key, very useful system. And the heart of it, of course, is that strange little formula. It looks something like a molecular structure. That's the tree of life drawn in the lightning bolt. It's a kind of template, a pattern corresponding to all things. I'm not going to go into lengthy details of what the various sephiroth mean in terms of such things as government and community organization and literature, which it can be used to understand. If you are interested in seeing that, I highly recommend the works of a man by the name of Halevi. There's probably, I think, almost 10 of them now, and they are excellent, and he goes into tremendous depth as far as how these systems can be used to understand any aspect of human experience. Halevi. Now, as a kind of secondary introduction, I want to make a general statement about metaphysics. Because in dealing with the Kabbalah, we're dealing with a system that is a royal path to abstraction. There are more people who get lost in the byways of Kabbalah than just about any other system there is. It's very easy to wind up locked in your room studying this stuff over and over and over and again, having tremendous experiences and really getting nowhere because they're not being used toward any social good, toward any help to other people as well as yourself. Metaphysics, among its taproots, has Plato. It's very important for us to realize that the Dark Ages, the period of the Church, was alleviated and produced the Renaissance by one simple addition to its corpus of literature, the Platonic dialogues. All it took was Plato's books restored to the learned of Europe, and next thing you know, we had a Renaissance. They are extremely profound, and although there have been arguments that Plato was not a mystic, any mystic who reads Plato instantly recognizes in every word and every sentence Plato's mysticism. Very recently, a very great writer with a tremendous sense of vision, D.H. Lawrence, said something that I think is very popular to say about metaphysics and something that needs to be considered, especially for metaphysicians. He said that if one of the people involved with Plato in a dialogue had stood up and kicked him in the rump, the world would have been a much better place, because as a result, Plato would have had a sense of reality, and we could have gotten on to less abstract forms of religion and spiritual experience. That's true in a sense, and it needs to be kept in mind. Metaphysics is not an end in itself. The trick is not to speak the language of metaphysics. It is to, through metaphysics, learn to speak the language of the world. Metaphysics is not intending to teach you to have a sure system that always works perfectly, that you can use to make decisions and to understand your world. It doesn't promise that at all. It's promising to make you much more wise about yourself, and as a result, wiser about other people. And in essence, metaphysics is the story of how you come to recognize God in yourself and God in everything else. A lot of people get lost without realizing that that is the very simple essence of it. Every single system resolves into that, whether it be Tibetan Buddhism or the Kabbalah or Native American religion. They have different words, but it means the same thing. That's the key experience. We live in a very intellectual society, and as a result, intellectual systems of metaphysics are in favor. That's because they are great fun. They're good games. They're good puzzles. They're a good thing to sharpen your intellect on. But as long as they're only that, they're not serving the purpose that their creators intended. The unfortunate thing is that the reason that 90% of metaphysics is so complicated is because the experience that the person who wrote the metaphysical book had was so intense that normal language couldn't be used to express it. And most of these people were not great artists, and as a result, they tripped over themselves trying to describe these experiences, trying to make them seem systematic, and most of all, trying to argue the non-believers of their time into believing it. We come along and read these records, and again, we get confused. They sound very different. There's all sorts of different emotions underneath the text, and we really don't know who to believe. We have to have the experience ourselves. And all these texts are sort of intended to give you blocks to work with. And the idea is that you'll pick up a block here, you'll go to a lecture, you'll read a book and pick up another block, you'll hear something on the television, you'll talk to a friend and get another block. And it may take lifetimes, it may take years, it may take months, it may take days, but eventually you're going to get just enough blocks, and then the experience happens. And from that moment on, you just laugh and say, that's it. That's what they were all talking about. And you throw out half your books because you realize that half of them were so garbled that it's just useless to even try. And you suddenly realize that a great many poets, a great many artists, a great many people that you didn't hear about being very mystical have all the answers, and they said it as simply as they could. A very good example of this, and a poet that I highly recommend, is the Persian poet Rumi, R-U-M-I. Virtually anything by him, but particularly the more modern translations. These are extremely simple poems. They have the essence of all metaphysical doctrine in them. They're more emotional, really, than intellectual. So with all those warnings to begin with, we'll finally now leap off into the origins of the Kabbalah. The word itself, Kabbalah, basically means reception or to receive or receiving. It can also be translated as oral reception, which again is right away a great warning. Secret teachings, oral reception. We don't write this stuff down. The theory is that some of it was written down for a very simple reason, and that was that around the late 12th century and early 13th century, they were killing Jews all over Europe, and a lot of Kabbalistic masters didn't know if they would be around to pass it on to anyone else. They couldn't pass it on to just anybody. They had to pass it on to somebody who was ready. And if they knew that there was a horde coming down on the village about ready to kill everybody in sight, they realized they didn't have the luxury of waiting a decade for somebody to come along who was just right for the reception of the teaching. And the rumor is, the myth is, that you had great rabbis disappearing into caves with the disciples who at least were intelligent enough not to copy things incorrectly and laying down all the oral doctrine that they had received. Now, as you can imagine, that gives us a tremendous sense of confusion. The scholars who are not very happy with the Kabbalah, it's too idealistic, say, oh no, it wasn't really an oral transmission. What it is some really bright mystic figured out that he would say it was an oral transmission, and that way get all this dignity for his work, and people who never would pay attention to it would then pay attention to it. This is possible. We have no way of proving it one way or the other. The Kabbalists themselves say something very different. They've got several stories, all of which agree, basically. The most audacious is that the Kabbalah was given to Adam as a means of making up for the loss of Eden. That is the most profound statement that anybody could tell you concerning the Kabbalah. The secret to the whole thing is right there. The idea is that when you're not in Eden, you need something to remind you of it. And that's what the Kabbalah is. It's a way to get back into Eden, a way to remind yourself of it. They also say it was given to Abraham, and they also say it was given to Moses, and that Moses was actually the one who promulgated it among the Levites, but it was passed down only amongst a select brotherhood, and continued to be passed down all the way through Hebraic history, and continues to be passed down now. No one knows who it's passed down to, is the unfortunate thing for we who are curious about it. But the idea is that there are schools that are active and have been active since the beginning of, actually since prehistory. To me, that appeals. I like that particular explanation. You're free to choose the more scholarly one, that it was actually written down later. But I'm now going to short-circuit all considerations about its origin by saying the actual origin of the Kabbalah is in the experience of the mystic, in the experience of the Kabbalist. And that is where it gets its meaningfulness. Whether it was actually given to Adam, or whether Moses knew about it, or whether it was first written down in the late 12th century, it makes absolutely no difference. For all we know, Moses wasn't as intelligent as we think he was. Maybe if he came up with a Kabbalah, we should forget about it. Never accept authority based on that. If it works, if it's true to experience, if you can understand it and make it work, and if it brings improvement to your life and brings greater understanding, then the origin is legitimate. And again, the origin is within the Kabbalist. The Kabbalah had a tremendous influence and continues to. It's hard to tell who influenced who is, of course, the problem. The Kabbalists have claimed that everything from Sufism through the Hermetic arts, European magical tradition, and sometimes even go so far as to say that the Hindu traditions were all Kabbalah. Of course, the Sufis say that Kabbalah and everything else was Sufi, and it goes on like that. So, again, you're left with that question that doesn't really mean much. Where did it originate? The point is that the people who practice the stuff, if you put them all in a room together, and if they really are masters of it, will have a great time and all agree completely in what they're doing, even though they're approaching it from different directions. Who originated it, again, depends on which system you happen to have a preference for. There's no question, however, that it has a tremendous influence on Christianity, and that it has had a tremendous influence on ceremonial magic and on the general tradition of Western Hermeticism. As a matter of fact, there was a tendency among many of the magi of that tradition to pull out the Hebrew scriptures to prove themselves correct. The idea was if you could read Hebrew, you were a magi. If you couldn't read Hebrew, no. There was a certain kind of luster to the Hebrew prophets, and the idea was that people like Eliphas Levi were in a way the continuation of the prophetic tradition, and there is certainly some truth in that. In Christianity, the work of Dionysius the Areopagite is very Kabbalistic. It could be argued that it was built out of Neoplatonism. It's very Platonic also, but then again we have Philo-Judaeus, a great Jewish Platonist, saying that everything in Plato came from the Bible. Of course, we have no reason to think that Plato lived the Bible. It's actually a good phrase, lived the Bible. We have no reason to think that he read the Bible, but on the other hand, it's possible there were influences we don't know about. Another audacious statement made by the Kabbalists is that the system was Egyptian, was the heart of the esoteric system of Egypt, and that when Moses left, it was very simply to preserve the Kabbalah because the Egyptians themselves had become so decadent that their priesthoods could no longer keep it pure. And so the children of Israel were sent out into the desert with that system to preserve it for the future of mankind. Now I'm going to show you a couple of little fancy things with these two small Kabbalistic trees up here to give you an idea how widespread and how subtle the Kabbalah is. I'm going to draw two symbols made from those two trees that you will all recognize. They've been symbols that you've seen since you were yay tall. And they are very suggestive that the cultures that use those symbols were influenced by Kabbalah, or at least the people who designed them were influenced by Kabbalah. Now, Kabbalists often talk about a missing Sephiroth, the 11th, that goes right here, and they call it Daf, or knowledge. So we'll draw that one in. And then we'll simply outline. And you have a very badly drawn Egyptian Ankh. Now that predates, of course, our biblical history, and it is suggestive that the Ankh, the symbol of life, and the tree of life are one and the same, but the simple use of an outline instead of the actual Sephiroth was the only distinction, and we, being such awake, intelligent creatures, have taken thousands of years to notice that they're really the same. And then over here we have an idea that the story of Christ, as we have it in the Bible, may be a Kabbalistic allegory, and that is because the story begins with the Star of Bethlehem, which is again very badly drawn. Let's do it this way. I think you can see that these are 5 points here of a star, and then ends on the cross. So we have as the beginning and end of the story of Jesus, the star and the cross. And as we discuss the Sephiroth, you'll see that this actually works out very well in terms of the symbology of Christ's crucifixion. So in a sense, the religious traditions that we have are riddled with Kabbalistic symbology. And what makes this especially notable is another aspect of Kabbalah that we will not go into in detail because it is far too confusing for lecture, and that is the use of the 22 Hebraic letters. I haven't lectured in a month, so I put myself on your mercy. These have been described beautifully by Mr. Hall as a collection of yods, a collection of little flames. And the idea is that they are a kind of configuration of 22 basic patterns basic to all reality. And they are divisible into 3, 7, and 12. Now, if you think about your symbology, you'll recognize that 3 is the Trinity, as it appears everywhere from Hindu cosmology to Christian theology. You may also recognize it as a yin and yang, and then the balance between the two. The 7 is instantly recognized as the 7 rays in that tradition, or the 7 lower octave planets, and the 12 corresponds, at least in one interpretation, to the zodiac. There are dozens, again, of interpretations of these particular symbols, of these numbers. So you can see that using that, and then the fact that each of the letters has a particular meaning to it. Some mean camel. Aleph, for example, means an ox yoked. So all these have symbols that have ulterior meanings to them. And if you start to put together the picture symbols with the numerology, and you begin to try and understand a text like the Sefer Yetzirah, which is a few pages of very tightly compacted symbology, again, you're in for years of work. But you can see that the use of numerology is definitely Kabbalistic, although it also dates back to Pythagoras. And you can see also that this is a system that has left a tremendous impact on what we might call New Age metaphysics. The problem is that a great deal of New Age metaphysics has gleaned a certain amount off of the Kabbalah, the idea that there are associations between the numbers and the letters, and has not used them to the depth that it perhaps should be used. There are very few books that treat this well, especially when it's applied to English. We happen to have the author of one of them here, but I'm not going to embarrass you. Everybody sees you, so they can talk to you in between. It's unquestionable that English can be understood Kabbalistically, but again, very complex system. And now you add to that the wonderful Hebrew idea that numbers that have the same numerical value mean the same thing roughly or have associated meanings. And so a Hebrew Kabbalist will pick up a section of the Bible and suddenly start to substitute words. And we may see that and think, these substitutions don't make any sense at all. But he's saying, oh, well, if you add all these letters up, they all add to 1,322. And the beauty of it is that it makes perfect sense when they do it. It's very difficult, again, to learn how to do it. You've got to be quite a Hebraic scholar to do it for the Bible. And, of course, the Greeks came along, and somewhere down the line it seems that there were some Greek Kabbalists who did the same thing with the Greek numerals, which are different from the Hebrew ones, and the confusion then becomes endless. We're going to focus on the Sephiroth and later on the four worlds, because those are the simplest and perhaps the most powerful parts of the Kabbalah in terms of personal practice. Now, I want to say immediately that the last two lectures in the series of 12, which are described as practical Kabbalah, if anyone here is a person who has read a great deal about Kabbalah and has an interest in magic, they may have had their appetites whetted by that particular usage of words, because practical Kabbalah refers to the ceremonial tradition in Kabbalah. And I want to put everyone's minds at rest, except those people who are hoping that I would do this, by saying that I'm not going to be going into the magical aspect of Kabbalah, although there will be a lecture on magic and Kabbalah. And the main reason I'm not going to do that is reducible to two statements made by Eliphas Levi, who was mentioned earlier by Art. And that is first, that everything you need to know about metaphysics is in a Rabelaisian sense of humor. If you can laugh at anything, and I mean anything, you're a metaphysician. And beyond that, he once said that all the ceremony in magic, I think it was in fact in The Great Secret that he says this, all the ceremonies in magic, that's for the people who don't know better. Those are the ways to get your discipline going. He pointed out, if you want to do a really killer ritual, what do you have to do? You've got to fast. You've got to control your diet. You've got to keep certain meditative hours. You've got to keep perfect balance for 2-3 weeks. You've got to be very aware of what's happening in the skies, the stars. And then you do your ritual. Levi hastened to add that it was the fasting and being aware of the stars and all that stuff that really made the difference for you spiritually. The ritual was nothing. You may have had tremendous experiences. Ceremonial magic can lead unquestionably to very deep levels of gnosis. There's no doubt about that. But it is so dangerous and so unnecessary to use magic to get those levels of gnosis. There are much quicker, much better ways than magic. And those ways are called mysticism. Because a mystic is doing the same thing as a magician, but he's doing it inside. He doesn't need to use the things outside except as a kind of laboratory of experimentation. So, having said that, let's go back now to some general consideration of the 10 Sephiroth. The system of the Kabbalah is very well borne out or symbolized by Adam Kadmon, the universal man, the cosmic man. This is the fellow in the Bible who had the golden head and the feet of clay. That is a very, very profound symbol of the human situation. On top, we're golden, solar, full of life eternity, limitlessness. And at the bottom, in our bodies, we're clay. We break easily, kind of stick to things, just an all-around mess compared to the gold. And it's very difficult for most people to reach both sides and balance them out. Kabbalah is a method of outlining that conjunction of the gold and the clay. And at the top, you have the gold, and at the bottom, you have the clay. Another way to say that is that at the top, which is called kether, or the crown, you've got the place, if you picture yourself as being touched by God somewhere in your soul, somewhere in your heart perhaps, and at that place where God's fingertip rests on you is your life. It's the hottest, lightest, brightest part of your being. And now if you extend that and understand that that fingertip touch, that point of light, is in every creature, in every molecule, in every solar system, in every being you can think of, and in infinite beings you can't think of, that's kether. That's the first point of the crown. Now around it are usually drawn 3 lines. The first limit is called ein, no thing. And this is a very cogent reminder to us that essentially God is unknowable. We can be known by God, but we cannot know God's entirety. There is always the unknowable aspect. And this is a kind of humility being taught to us by the Kabbalists, the understanding that there's always the no thing to be considered in mysticism, philosophy, and religion. Human ignorance is a component of our experience, and we have to accept it, and in fact enjoy it for the wonderful mystery that it is. After that we get Ein Sof, the limitless, the infinite. These are 3 circles around kether that I didn't draw there. These are like halos around kether. I'll explain in a minute what they really are, why they're circles. And then the third is called Ein Sof Aur, the limitless light. Now what these are points of concentration. You begin with the completely unconditioned, the no thing, and that concentrates into the infinite. And that concentrates into the infinite light. And then you actually get to the point of kether, the first sephiroth, which is that fingertip touch we were talking about. Now, to further complicate matters, this should actually be 4 Kabbalistic trees on top of each other. The 4 worlds. We'll go into that in a different lecture. And the idea is that the kether of the bottom world, the world of creation, this world, is the lowest sephiroth of the next higher. And it goes on like that up to 4. So you've got these different levels that we'll talk about later. Now let's go down a little bit. You get the first polarity, could draw another line and make that a triangle, of the supernal triad. And the one on the left is usually designated Bina, understanding, and the one on the right is usually designated Shokma, or wisdom. Another way to think of it is the right is zodiac, is the overall pattern of things. Yang, it's the energy going out. And Bima, understanding, can be thought of as yin, the receptive energy, the energy coming in. Now you can see right away that you have an arrangement of 3 columns here, even though I drew them rather badly. It's almost a triangle. The middle column is called the middle path, oddly enough. And the one on the left is called the path of severity, or the column of severity, and the one on the right is called the column of mercy. This becomes extremely important, as we'll see a little bit later in the lecture, in terms of understanding our own mystical experience, because this is a kind of tremendous diagnostic device. You can look at the tree of life and diagnose where you're weak, where your experience is off balance. For example, if you read the work of an academic philosopher who is heavily involved in logic and in scientific positivism, you find that the elements that are especially present in their text are all elements on the tree, or rather the column of severity. And that the elements on the other, the column of mercy, are hardly present at all. So these books tend to be very powerful in terms of their reception of tradition, bima. They have the severity of this sephiroth directly below bima, which is called severity, in that they are very judgmental and very critical of things outside their tradition. And then finally you get down to hod, where they are exercising a kind of mercurial division of reality into compartments that are very useful in terms of understanding the world, but are very dangerous if they are not reunited after they're used. What you don't find is the other side of the tree, which begins up here with Shokma, wisdom, which is kind of the divine archetypal pattern. This would be the wideness of the picture. In other words, they only receive their tradition. They don't move out and break tradition to discover raw experience. And then you move down and you get mercy. They are not merciful about the people they criticize. And then finally you get down to the very Venusian Netzach, which has a kind of ability to attract. It's kind of the harmony and beauty aspects of life, and these texts tend to be extremely inharmonious and very boring and that sort of thing. They don't have the sensual values of Venus. And then, of course, because you've only got one side of the column, you're completely missing the middle column, which is a column that all of us should be most concerned with. And that column begins with a direct touch of divinity. That means that their work is not inspiring. You don't read that work and come away with a mystical experience, with an experience of the immanent presence of God. You move down to Tifareth, beauty. They lack an appreciation for beauty. They lack beauty in themselves. You move down to the next one, the third down, Yesod, the foundation, which is to say that they lack a kind of soul foundation. They lack an awareness that in this plane, factual matter is illusory, it's lunar, it's changing all the time. That any kind of static statement about something that is becoming, that's always in flux, is bound to be wrong in some way or another. And finally, Malkuth, the world, because they are not in contact with the physical world, and that's why most people won't read them. Now, you can take astrological attributions here, which I'll do very briefly. There will be a lecture that will go more deeply into that. You begin, again, Kether doesn't take that attribute of astrology. It's unconditioned. Then you move down to Shokma here, which is the entire zodiac, on the right side and the top. And then on the left, Bima, Saturn. And then you come down. Oh, I did that wrong. That's a backwards lightning bolt. Isn't that interesting? I'll think about that. Maybe I'll make a comment about it later. Then you come down to Mars here and Jupiter here. You come down to the Sun, Mercury, Venus, the Moon, and the four elements. Very interesting if you know your astrology. If you don't, then you'll have to come back to the other lecture and I'll explain that in greater depth. The beauty of the system is this picture of balance. In that sense, it's yoga. Yoga means union, and yoga is the middle path. Yoga is the path of uniting. If you do hatha yoga, for example, you work on balance and stretching. Balance and stretching. And this is very much what the Kabbalah is doing. The balance is on the middle column, and the stretching is developing the attitudes on the outer columns. So, for an example, let's take a normal life, normal person's life, whatever that is. Middle path. I've always thought that was part of the sense of humor that I was talking about. Now, one way that we could draw this would be that, how shall I do this? Let's do it in terms of experience, in terms of human faculties. And we can use the astrology, so in a way you're getting a preview. I'm cheating myself. Down here we've got the four elements in Malkuth. And these you can be understood as the four body humors of the Paracelsians. These are the four aspects, fire, earth, air, water, that you have to balance to be a healthy human being. You can understand that in terms of diet, having a good balance of diet, having a good balance of exercise, a good balance of sleep, a good balance of work, that sort of thing, to keep physical health. So that's that level of experience, not terribly enlightening, but very necessary, and much more enlightening than most people think it is. You move up to the level of Yesod, and that's imagination. Very important to be able to imagine. Too many metaphysicians fall in love with certain metaphysical systems because they're so imaginative and don't realize that imagination and truth are not necessarily exactly the same thing. There are forms of imagination that are symbolic of truth, but you've got to recognize the symbolism. For example, theosophy could be boiled down into 10 pages of ideas. Blavatsky knew that very well. But in the 19th century, when you wanted to impress all these really anti-feminine people who were great believers in the superiority of the white Christian, you needed to get out there with all this bombast and confuse them. And she did a beautiful job of it. Both an insult and a compliment. Even though she's sneering at me from over the shoulder. We move from imagination. We should move this direction. And make you use your imaginations now by reversing the lightning bolt. To Mercury, to that level of experience, communication. A good way to think of it is that your powers of mentality are the powers that need to balance things and to be able to divide them very surely, to understand the distinctions in value, for example, so that you can make decisions about what things are best for you, about what things you need to become involved with. Now, as we mentioned, the intellect has run amok in our culture, and as a result, most people are ruled by their intellects. That means that those scales are thrown out the window, first of all, and the sword is used by itself. The scales are used to tell the weight between two different things. In other words, what is its value? And unfortunately, very few people who are intellectual are open to stepping back from their intellect and then saying, this is a real pretty picture, this is kind of irrational, but let's see which has more value, which really works better. Very important part of intellect. And then, of course, the sword of distinction is not intended for slashing out at our friends and decapitating their fond beliefs, but is intended rather to help us to understand by first drawing a distinction between two things, seeing why one side is good and one side is bad, in quotes, and then reuniting them, seeing how they're one thing and how they're two degrees of one pole, a spectrum, not two opposites. You might try something that's a lot of fun in terms of this mercurial experience, and that is look out into the world and find enemies. Find two doctrines, two ideas, two sorts of people who absolutely despise each other and who spend all their time in rhetoric telling everybody about how evil the other one is. If you take those two, what you'll discover is that they're two sides of the same coin. And that if you want to know what the answer to the situation is, it's always in the middle path. One of these people is lost then in the column of severity, and these are the people who are saying, it's got to be this way, and life's tough, and all that stuff. And then you get the people who are lost in effervescence. The world is wonderful and merciful, you don't have to do anything, and there's no suffering, and that sort of thing. The truth is the beauty that comes when you take those two and you put them together. Something that is very difficult to understand, because metaphysics does teach there is no evil, that all suffering is good, that all suffering leads you to self-enlightenment, and that evil is ignorance. But it doesn't mean there isn't pain. It doesn't mean that while you're suffering for your own good, you're miserable. And the beauty of metaphysics is in the luster of being aware of the suffering at the same time that you're aware of the ecstasy. That's when you become a complete person. You're able to accept both sides. And we move from there to here, Venus. And these are the experiences that could be described as the emotional side of the mind-emotions question, mind-heart. There's a big propensity, again, to say, There's the mind and there's the emotions. They are extremely connected. There are very few thoughts that don't have a very powerful emotional root and very few emotions that don't have thoughts. They really go together. And in fact, despite what most philosophers and many Platonists want to tell you, emotions, as the Kabbalah shows us, are primary. And the simple proof of that is that for 99% of the human race, you can think all you want. When your emotions get in there and say, I want, you do it. The problem is generally not that your mind is so powerful that it doesn't allow you to feel. Very few people like that. Even Spock felt on the Star Trek. And then we're going to have to pause as soon as we get up here. Tifareth is the sun. This corresponds to Leo in the astrological designation. This is self-expression. It's the beautiful essence. It's the idea, maybe it's perhaps best understood in terms of art. Art is something that is deeply misunderstood. We don't understand, in general, what creates a genius, what makes a painting that's just stunning, what makes a really stunning piece of writing. We think, well, it's just they're born that way, that sort of thing. And it's really not the case. If you begin to read the biographies, you discover that they all do the same thing, they all read the same people, they all are aware of each other, and they all basically practice one form of mind. And this is partially the process of coming to know and accept every part of themselves. The vicious, the unpleasant, the ugly is in there with the most beautiful and most exalted. And they accept all of it. And it's often been said about Shakespeare that he was able to portray so many different characters and emotions that most people have wondered if there ever was a Shakespeare. Who wrote that stuff? How could anybody understand all those different points of view? The reason that Shakespeare is so great and so moving is because Shakespeare accepted and knew all those parts of himself. This is true of all great art. Great art stuns us because it comes from such a depth of self-understanding. And that's the beauty that is in Tifareth. And you notice that that's the bottom of the cross. And so what we've got here is we're pausing at this point with what is actually the mundane expression of human experience. Everybody gets this. This is sort of, when you come down here, you get these four sephiroth intact. You have the ability to express yourself. You may not use it very much, but you have it. You've got the ability to appreciate harmony and beauty and the desire to attract those things, to have emotions, in other words. You've got the ability to think. You've got an imagination, and you've got a body. You also have the stuff that makes up the star, and when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about how those five elements, which seem more distant, are actually very present to us, and how a practical application can be made of an understanding that they exist. We're going to take a brief break. I'm going to bore you with our two poems. And I'm going to have Art read his first, but since I'm lecturing, it's up to me to throw him to the lions, and then I can decide, no, I'm not going to read mine, in case it completely bombs.
Thank you very much.
Note of confidence, Art Johnson.
I was reading a dialogue of Plato's. That lets you know how very deep I am. And actually got to a commentary that Thomas Taylor had added by Proclus. It was a very simple thing. It was talking about the migration of souls at midnight. That's when souls migrate especially the souls of pumpkins. So in my own kind of I live in California way, I thought of that time as Plato's high noon. And this is the poem. Sands shift as souls scramble under Plato's high noon. Only midnight's moisture can quench the mind's thirst, bringing sleep. When I am too tired to think, heavenly thoughts tumble down, drifting on a moonless night when breath crawls. I turn to you during dark hours. you shining within my happiness, soft, fluttering wings at rest, lying close to the forgiven. Lull me past my own thoughts and into yours. Those beautiful looks of pride you assume when someone reaches the top, wide-eyed, and gasps for air.
Art is going to have a poem, not that one, published in the next journal. This one's called 50,000 Names. You're going to notice immediately that we have very different styles. It'll be interesting to see what the result of that is. Collect pictures of God from 50,000 prophets. Chase 50,000 idols. Power, riches, safety, Christ, Yahweh, Nirvana, dignity, acceptance, appreciation, Allah, Satori, and Krishna. While you run, surprise! 2 names of God combine. 2 worlds meet. 2 streams rush together. Moment by moment, the 50,000 names of God discover they are each other. 1 word in different letters. A world cut apart by fear, ignorance, and the weariness of separation from love. Push back the curtain of letters. Forget those clicking beads. Go inside. There you'll find the divine animal, so beautiful it demands 50,000 names. Thank you. Now, back to the Kabbalah. This, by the way, was an experiment, and you've all been wonderful guinea pigs. No insult intended, guinea pigs are wonderful animals. And the reason it was an experiment was because we were wondering if the poetic consciousness and the Kabbalistic lecture consciousness would clash like bad colors, but they don't seem to have. They seem to be humming along rather nicely. So I think we'll be making this a habit, providing that we have enough poems to do that. Otherwise, we'll be getting these maudlin personal poems that really have nothing to do with the lecture. But now we're going up to the star aspect of our experience. This is a part that a lot of people never get. And the reason they don't get it is very simple. The initial balance, these two, whenever you get the Sephiroth on opposite sides, you know you're talking about balance. And usually when you balance them, they free the next one up. So of course up there on the 5 stars, you've got a real bigger problem because you've got 2 polarities to balance. But this polarity, mind and emotion, has to reach a perfect balance before true self-expression occurs, before you find that sun inside you, that great sun of creativity. Not many people achieve that. We don't have many records of it. Unfortunately, many of the mystics who achieve it don't tell us about it. The vast majority of enlightened mystics don't talk about it. They have their own ways of teaching. You run into them and that sort of thing, but they don't go out and promulgate it among people. The few that have, some of them didn't have as good a command of symbology and language as one might like. But here and there in history you do find characters who really show that balance in their work. You get a poet like Rumi, you get a playwright like Shakespeare, you get these tremendous creators who have found the depths in both directions. But now let's move on past there. If you achieve that balance and you get your self-expression, immediately these 5 upper Sephiroth are evoked. Immediately you're dealing with that problem or that opportunity, depending on how you want to see it. The first polarity that you have to deal with is on this side Mars and on this side Jupiter, or severity and mercy. Now one way of looking at that is that on the Mars side you have the energy in your life, the energy of going out and doing things, breaking them apart, separating them. It's that strength that enables you to say no or to say yes in painful situations. It's the ability to act as though there were distinctions, even if you feel deep down inside that there aren't, because sometimes those kind of actions are necessary for survival and even for teaching. It's the ability to be forceful. Now, you can see immediately, let's use an artist as an example, that having balanced mind and emotion and achieve full self-expression, you've got a great artist on your hands. And the first problem the great artist has to deal with is Mars. Because a great artist, if any of you are great artists or aspiring great artists, you may have experienced this, has to deal with the business world and the real world out there and all that kind of thing. And if they don't, they usually fail miserably. Very difficult, unless they're lucky and they get a partner who happens to know this stuff. But generally, they have to defend themselves. So you get a character like Picasso, who you may or may not think is a great artist, but who certainly had that depth of expression, and who was a terrific businessman and had a very well-developed sense of force, ability to get done what needed to be done. And of course, this is also a form of discipline. It's the force that enables a person to write a great deal, to be committed, to ride roughshod over the hard bumps along the path. Very necessary once you've developed the ability to express yourself. And then, of course, providing that you master that, you've got the other side of that polarity, which is a very humorous kind of situation in our culture, which is generally if you're talented and you are strong, people immediately want to worship you. They want to give you all this stuff. We saw that in Picasso's life. We see it repeatedly. People feel that this is the kind of person I'd like to be. They project their own desires on the person, and the person winds up getting a great deal of Jupiterian riches, respect, and gets a name, gets fame, and all that sort of thing, which any artist will tell you is a big problem to deal with, because the tendency is to get lost in there and lose touch with all this other stuff. And so you can see how the force and the Jupiterian, let's call it wealth, complement each other. Because when you have a good reputation, when you have security in a material sense and dignity, you can afford not to be forceful all the time. But on the other hand, you must have forcefulness to be able to not defeat other people who are bothering you, but defeat your own addiction to fame and those kinds of things. Picasso, for example, made a habit out of surprising people, constantly coming out with different art forms. And you can just imagine if he had a lovely, let's say an old Jewish mother behind him saying, "Don't do it, don't shake the boat. Everybody loves you now. Don't take any risks." That's why he took risks every time he turned around. Why? Because the artistic integrity had to be kept. And at the risk of being rude, I'll mention Salvador Dali, who didn't do that, and as a result fell to self-parody in general in his last few decades of creativity. Very important to master that. And of course, you can see in terms of desire, we can start down here, and we'll pause because we have a thing called the abyss between the next level and the one we've been on. And we can say that in a person's life, you can fasten desires onto different aspects of what we've shown here, usually several at the same time. So for example, you can be entirely focused on the body, totally focused on being fit, looking well, diet, and spend all your time working on that element. You can be totally fixed in imagination. Many people who are addicted to drugs or alcohol, many people who are addicted to escapism or lost in imagination. It's been said in theosophy, the astral world, wandering in the astral world. And then you move up and you can get yourself addicted to the mind, to being logical, to thinking well, to knowing the history of thought and that sort of thing. And you can get addicted on the other side to the sensual, to Venusian practices, sensuality, pleasure, harmony, beauty. And the point is, fine, but be addicted to all of them, because they all balance each other out. If you want all of them, if you want to be intellectually stimulated and intelligent, and you want to be Venusian, and you want to have an appreciation of beauty and harmony and the sensual aspects of life, perfect, because these two will balance each other out, and what you'll get is Aristotle's famous in nothing, in all things, not too much, the doctrine of the mean or the middle path. And of course, there are people who focus on self-expression, and what that is idolatry of a sort, because you can bet if there's a great big hero, so you know somebody who worships somebody else, what they're worshiping is that person's power of self-expression. They're saying, boy, I would like to be that. I'd like to be able to get out there and do that. And 9 times out of 10, they don't know how to do it. They don't realize that it's a process of working up these levels and not simply, I'm born famous, that sort of thing. It's work. even in musicians and artists and such people that we don't appreciate. And then, of course, you can be focused on riches and dignity up on that level. I think you can see, though, how right away this is a different sort of person. We tend to think that anybody who's risen above this level of self-expression is somehow different, is a higher type of person, that sort of thing, at least in our culture. So if you tell someone, well, I'll tell you what I'm after, boy. I'm after going out there and having all the fun I can have. We usually think, oh, well, that's not too impressive. And if they tell you that they want to be the most brilliant genius, we also think, not so good. But when we get up here and somebody tells us, I want to be rich and dignified and I want to be a pillar of the community, that we usually think, well, that's pretty good. I mean, that's not a bad way to go if you're going to go some direction. A person who goes to the other direction there, Mars, in our culture is not very popular. In other cultures was extremely popular. These are the warriors. These were the generals. These were the great chieftains who led Greece to war, that sort of thing. And they were at one time very much respected, and they still are in the sense that the generals, the military, the Pentagon in our culture is still very important and has a certain dignity associated with it. Now we have what's called the abyss. This is between the supernal triad and the seven that came below. When you read books on Kabbalah, especially 19th century books, and especially when you read magicians on the Kabbalah, and one of the most guilty of this is the infamous Aleister Crowley, you read the abyss. There's all this stuff about the abyss and about how he rigged up this process that took days of experimentation and preparation to cross the abyss, and he barely came back alive. If you're a mystic, you know at that point that Aleister Crowley did have a mystical experience, but boy, was he on the wrong track. Because real mystics cross the abyss like this all the time. And in India, you've got your enlightened masters, as they've been called. You've got people who are enlightened, and we have examples like Sri Ramana Maharshi, Sri Ramakrishna. You just read their work and you see it glittering in their words. These people live between the supernal triad and the seven lower sephirot. They live on the abyss. They're conscious of both. And the reason that it's so dangerous in magic is quite simple, because you're rising from the personal level to the transpersonal level. And when you're using ritual, physicality to accomplish that, you get tripped up. And if you happen to have a very powerful imagination, as all good ceremonial magicians do, and you happen to also have a tremendous concentration, you can cause yourself a great deal of mental and spiritual, really, exhaustion, because you put so much effort into crossing that abyss. But I hasten to tell you that the abyss is like the veil of Isis. A lot of talk about the veil of Isis. You will never look beyond the veil of Isis. What is the veil of Isis? What is the abyss? What is this stuff? Very simple. The veil is the limit of the human power to experience the presence of God. Our senses limit the world. Our senses were not made to take it in its entirety. We have been made as embodied creatures to see a certain spectrum of light, to hear a certain spectrum of sound. The reason that that is the case is that if we heard and saw everything, and add all the other senses, we'd be bombarded with stimuli, unable to survive, unable to make decisions, unable to choose what we have to do, all that sort of thing. So a person on the mystical path, and this is where a lot of the wonder working of mystical practitioners comes from, tends to be a person who has developed sensitivity to a tremendous level. There are all kinds of wonderful Sufi stories about Sufis doing a kind of Sherlock Holmes, apparently reading somebody's mind, and it turns out that no, they were just so much more aware of what's around them. They were looking at the way the person was dressed and what they were doing and the gestures and how insects around them were responding and all this stuff, and as a result they were able to reason a conclusion that everybody else thought was magic. That's because the veil is being withdrawn further back. They're seeing more and more of life. Their senses are more and more sensitive. As a result, they see things and they hear things that a person not interested in such things doesn't see or hear, and it's just that simple. And that's why it is possible for someone with a very materialistic state of mind to read a mystic and think that they are completely out of their minds. Because within the definition of mind of the materialist, they are out of their minds. They're living in a much wider mind, one that includes the materialist's mind, but is much vaster than it, because it includes the irrational. So the veil, then, or the abyss, is where we cross over from the world that is comfortable and known to us into the world that is now really spiritual, metaphysical, a world of principles, world of forms, if you like. And as we said, when you rise up above the four, you sort of leave the average person, because what you develop is the one here who's looking for a distinction, the Jupiterian, the one who wants to be the pillar of society. And on the other side you have the warrior. And in a sense, both of them are a little unhinged. They've been described as being kind of nutty. And interestingly enough, you do find a lot of pillars of community and a lot of soldiers who are very interested in metaphysical things. George Patton, who was a great believer in reincarnation. And you run into a surprising number of people in high echelons, both financially and militaristically, who are very interested in these metaphysical things. And part of the thing that makes them seem odd to us is that they dedicate their lives to an ideal that endangers the security that most of us associate with living for something that we cannot perhaps understand as such an important goal. We may say, I don't need that much. I don't really want to turn out to be the richest human being in the Western Hemisphere. That's not my ambition, but if somebody else wants to do that, that's fine. But there's a sense that the person is fanatical. And there's a kind of almost respect for that in the sense that they are doing something superhuman. There's sacrifice involved. There's strong effort involved. So you can see that we've risen above the, quote, average human being, which is a terrible word, but the only one we have. And then, on the other side, the Mars side, we know they're crazy because they're willing to die for a principle, for an ideal. And most of us are not willing to die for principles and ideals. So we balance those two out. You get a Socrates. You get somebody who is perfectly willing to commit suicide when ordered to do so very courageously, but is not harming other people, is simply living courageously, and is a kind of pillar of the community even if he was an unwanted pillar. Then we move past the abyss, and we get to the supernal triad. You can picture this like a triangle just glowing, and the top half is like a sun. It's just blindingly bright. And what you get is yin and yang, simple way to put it. The root... Please go ahead.
When you're speaking of crossing the abyss and so forth, I wondered, having made attempts to read Teilhard de Chardin, and just going off the bike, just falling asleep through his theoretical stuff, and then reading his, what essentially to me is poetry, that's like Mass on the World, and that kind of, and just finding it to be wonderful. I really kind of got the impression that he hadn't tried quite so hard to be a scientist, which he didn't seem to do a real hard job of doing, and let himself be a mystical poet, which he was wonderful. He and everybody else would be much happier, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a good example too, because the culture is weighted toward the pillar of severity, toward the intellect and scientific objectivism and this sort of thing. There is a tendency to sweep along with that, and it's not a very healthy thing. And it's also interesting to note that the Sufis were always masters at figuring this out, because what they would do in their culture was, when everything got real scientific, one of them would pop out with this incredibly mystical, lusty poetry that horrified everybody in sight, but had the intended effect. It reminded people that they had bodies, and that they had to deal with that side of things, and that, in fact, if you were a mystic and you want to help the world, and you're writing books that nobody can read except people who've had 15 years of graduate education and speak 10 languages and that sort of thing, you're not doing a lot to help people. But if you can write something nice and simple that still has those understandings in it, you can help a lot more. One thing you can say, though, about him is that, in a sense, he may have seen part of his mission to be reaching to intellectuals and trying to convince them in their own language. So if you don't need to be convinced, then it's kind of the wrong thing to read. So yin and yang, there on the top polarity in the supernal triad. everything resolves into opposites. You've got male and female, you've got dark and light, you've got negative and positive, and all these opposites. It needs to be understood, again, that they are degrees in a spectrum. A big, big, big problem in our culture, and the source of a great deal of human suffering, is that people do not understand the idea of degrees. People say black or white, yin or yang, wisdom or understanding. Those unfortunately sound too similar in our language, but in the Hebrew there's quite a difference there. One is, in a sense, active and the other is passive, as in yin and yang. As a result, there's tremendous intolerance, fear, hatred, distrust. Not understanding that the very far right and the very far left, these are simply furthest degrees at a particular time. And there is a sequence of steps that leads to the middle. One of the most profound things that I ever learned, and that I absolutely throw out to you with sparklers and roses and whatever else so that you notice it, because if you put it into application it has a tremendous result, is this. India has given you the whole secret of their metaphysical practice in one word: yoga, union. And the way you put it to practice is very simple. When you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, I can do this or I can do that, you've got opposites. And neither one is very clear. Maybe you're favoring one but not the other. Do yoga. Find the center between them and go in the center. Think of it this way, that you're kind of a not terribly intelligent but well-meaning beast of burden, and the only way that you can be told what to do is to tap you on either side of the head. And the idea is, when you get these situations that are dichotomies, when you can't make up your mind, that you've been tapped on both sides of the head. Now, a lot of people, when they get tapped on both sides of the head, absolutely go insane. Because they don't, what do you mean, left or right? I don't know what to do. And what's being said is, straight ahead. Find the middle path. Very, very effective. And if you want to have some real fun and you have the time, read Gandhi's autobiography, where every decision he makes is based on that principle of yoga. And as a result, he winds up doing things that everyone thinks are miraculous. And he says all along, I just went the middle path. I took the path that God was telling me to go down, in between the two extremes. So, yin and yang, then, nevertheless, are the creating arms of the deity. Between receptivity and action, the world is formed. Between passive and active. And human life is a kind of a wave structure, like ocean. And you have your passive times, and you have your active times, and what makes human life so unbearably beautiful and sometimes complex and difficult is that they happen at the same time. So while you're passive with one thing, you need to be active with something else, and sometimes you can have 10 of these going along at once, similar to biorhythms, but a different idea. And as a result, you can get very confused because you want to get out there and be active, but another part of you needs to be passive. So as you can tell, you need to be able to hear those voices. And it's very useful to be able to look at the polarities, to understand yin and yang, and to see them working in your own experience. It's even possible, might be suggested, that a lot of prophecy, as such, that works out in the interim, is based on a very profound understanding of these dynamics, of the middle and the left and the right. If you can identify when something is too far to one direction, you can pretty well predict it's going to swing back just so far in the other direction. And if you have a good enough sense of history, you can have a pretty good shot at picking the right time when it's going to happen. And a great deal of Sufi prophecy in particular, which tends not to name names and that sort of thing and dates, will do this. Will, for example, there's a wonderful Sufi story about when the Mongols swept down into Persia. This is an aspect of history that's very important, even though it has nothing to do with the Kabbalah. Actually, it does, because there were a lot of Kabbalists there when it happened. Truly. At that time, Islam was the preeminent culture in the world. They had poetry that is by far superior to the tradition of poetry in the West. They had incredible arts, painting. They had tremendous architecture, tremendous scientific advances. And if it were not for them, we would not have the entirety of Greek philosophy. They preserved Plato. They preserved Aristotle. Tremendous culture. Well, when the Mongols came sweeping down, the bloodshed was absolutely unbelievable. There were entire cities with hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children completely destroyed, wiped out to a person. And the idea is, and it's quite true, that it has taken Islam all these centuries to even begin to rebuild itself. And such situations as the fundamentalism in Iran are the result of this kind of long process of self-healing in an attempt to rebuild the kind of cosmopolitan culture that Islam once had. There are places where it's flaring up, like Saudi Arabia, but it's only the very beginning, perhaps, of a renaissance there. As a result of this sweeping of the Mongols, of course, many people simply ran away into the mountains. And what they found in the mountains were schools of Sufis, schools of dervishes who lived there for many, many years. And one of them in particular had a whole community show up, a whole small village. And this is one of the Sufis who was not particularly pleasant, and told them in no uncertain terms, look, this is your fault. If you hadn't gotten decadent and weak and this and that, it never would have happened. And he really told them off, and they all got very depressed. And as a result, he wanted to cheer them up. And he said, all right, he said, I'll tell you this. You can bank on it. You didn't put it that way. He said, your children will see the complete annihilation of the Mongol hordes. And of course it happened. Wow. Everybody thought, how could he? Well, very simple. He looked and he said, what an extreme. The Mongols waxed into the greatest power in the world that fast. And to him, knowing yin and yang, it was obvious that fast they would disappear. And that's exactly what happened. So there's an example of prophecy as understanding. Something that Mr. Hall never tires of saying is that there is nothing that's supernatural. Everything is natural. When people say supernatural, they mean something natural they don't understand. But all experience is natural. So you have to balance those elements out. In a Jungian paradigm, or just in a general psychological paradigm, you could say that this is balancing the overall masculine and feminine. That after you are able to balance out, we have our example of the artist, your self-expression into forcefulness and a sense of security and dignity, responsibility, even better word, you have to then deal with those yin and yang energies in yourself, with the feminine and the masculine. This includes all the dichotomies, life and death, desire and repulsion, all those elements of ourselves. That becomes the arena in which the person has to work. Essentially, to put it real simple, what you're working on is balance, the final balance. You've gotten your position in society on that top level. You've gotten your self-expression, so you have a good flow of inspiration. You've gotten the balance between emotions and mind. Your imagination is strong and your body is healthy. So what do you work on? You work on a much more subtle balance. And this is the balance that produces a truly enlightened human being. And this is where many people fall down. Because what happens is, you get up there and everything's going pretty well. You don't necessarily, I might add, have to turn into Picasso for this to be the case. You can, in your own level, achieve that kind of balance. And this happens on multiple levels all the time. What you wind up with is the challenge of keeping the enlightened state of consciousness. You're reading and you're reading and you're reading and you're going to lectures and you're meditating and you're writing down your dreams in a journal and you're doing all the things that you do for inspiration. And all of a sudden, boom! Mystical experience. And believe me, if you haven't had one, when you do, you'll know it. Because it blasts everything else into non-existence. And you suddenly realize this stuff is real. The most real thing you've ever felt. After you have that experience, you think, and then boom, back on the ground. And that happens over and over again until you despair at the idea of ever being able to hold that balance. But that's the balancing of the yin and yang. It happens much more quickly than we think. And the way it happens is that instead of focusing on it, you see what happens is you get up there on Kether, you suddenly have the opening of the light, this tremendous experience of a greater reality than what you're used to. And you think, down here, this is what they described in Jacob Amy's such and such. Or over here you feel a lot of self-satisfaction. You feel like, boy, this is great. Some people even say, this is better than sex. This is just the ultimate sensuality. Or you get down here on self-expression and you think, I've got to tell everybody about this. And of course what happens is that instead of being focused way up here on the yin and yang, you come crashing down here and it all shuts off. For your own good, I might add, because you might be dangerous to yourself and other people if you went off half-cocked without a perfect balance. Now, if you're a good mystic, a good metaphysician, you know that this is a problem of balance, and you immediately go up to yin and yang, not realizing that the tree of life is like a spine, and that when one part goes out, they all go out. So in other words, you can't go up to the very top and start balancing yin and yang, because next thing you know, you have no job, your art has gone down the tubes, nobody likes you anymore, it's a big mess. And you think, this is totally wrong, what's happening here? The reason is that you need to go all the way back down to the bottom again. Quickly, but you need to go back down to the bottom. You've had the mystical experience, the best thing you can do is exercise, quite truly. Take care of your health. Take a walk. Eat something. Whatever. Get back down into the body. You've had the experience now. Remember, the body's a partner in all this. It's sort of the coil that attracts the signal, and you've got to keep it in good shape. So immediately kind of pet it on the head and say, it's okay, I still love you, I'm still going to take care of you. And then, you've got to get up to the imagination, read some poetry, read some science fiction, read some theosophy, whatever you like that really stimulates the imagination. Or just sit around daydreaming. Get that going again, make sure that's going nicely. And then jump up and make sure you've got a nice balance in the emotions and the mind. A journal is a very handy thing to keep, for example, because you can immediately recognize what's happened if you write down mystical experience and the next thing is a gigantic quotation from some metaphysical author. You know you're way over on the mental side, and you better write about your emotions and how you felt about it and that sort of thing, which is still a little mental, but at least you're dealing with the emotions. You look at the self-expression, maybe you write something about it. Write a poem about it, paint a painting about it. Art is an extremely important form of mystical practice. Even if you're no good at all, anything, carpentry, any kind of working with your hands, something that you can create as a symbol to yourself of what happened to you. Even if it's just a bunch of dots or whatever, something that means that experience to you. Very important. Helps to crystallize it in a nicely balanced manner. And then you have to move up from there, make sure that you're still eating, that you've got a job and your status in the community is okay. You haven't passed out in the middle of a lecture and had a mystical experience and you woke up, everybody was gone and nobody ever wanted to hear you lecture again. And then you also make sure that you've still got your forcefulness, that you feel the ability to do that. And then you can play with the yin and yang. Then you can get back to the balance. Then you can do that very subtle game. And the only way I can describe it is as music. Music, any kind of art really is a preeminent way of getting a sensitivity for this balance. Music is especially good because everything has to resolve. A good poem has to resolve. A good piece of music has to resolve. A good painting has to resolve. They have to balance. And you quickly learn, if you are a practicing poet or artist of any kind, that until you have such balance, you're not going to produce anything worthwhile. And the surest way then of discovering how your balance is going is when you sit down to write a poem and either nothing comes out or something comes out that's so hideously garbled that you put it away and decide not to write for another week or the rest of your life, depending on how bad it is. That is a very good barometer then of these balances. But again, music is a good example because you have to sense what the appropriate action is. And you can be very easily fooled. You can, for instance, do 2-3 weeks of very difficult work, very dedicated. You don't really touch your mystical stuff. You don't go too far into it. You just try and keep your meditating, you keep your dream journal going, whatever practices are your foundational practices. And then you stop. And you think to yourself, boy, the next couple days, Nothing is going to drag me out of the house. I'm going to just sit back and read the things that really inspire me. I'm going to relax completely. I'm going to write some poetry, whatever. And you get up in the morning and you just don't feel like it. Everything else comes to your mind. You think, well, I'd like to go do this, I'd like to go do that. There's that dichotomy because you can't tell which side it is. Is it the side that is mentality saying, no, logically, you should be active today, that sort of thing. You need to be very sensitive to intuit the appropriate response. And of course, you can experiment. A very good way to keep a journal is to keep those experiments. To say, today, I logically felt like I should go out, but I emotionally felt like I should stay in. I stayed in and had a great day. And if you find that every time you write that down, you go with the emotions and it works, and whenever you go with the mind, it doesn't, you've learned which side to listen to, at least 9 times out of 10. Very simple approach toward understanding those feelings. But the idea is to keep your activities balanced, to be involved in all these different forms of experience, not in any one too much. When you do that, you can preserve, at least more consistently, what might be called an enlightened state. That door stays open instead of being shut. Actually, it's never shut, but our awareness shuts, and we forget that it's there. But if you can keep that balance going, you can stay open for quite some time. That, of course, is what the practice of Zen is about. When Zen says that you've got to learn to experience satori, to experience enlightenment while you're sweeping a broom, they're basically telling you that you've got to even be able to do housework and maintain an enlightened frame of mind. Actually, housework is a terrific way to maintain it. Very good.
There was, I forgot who it was, a modern writer was talking about that man they call the enlightened cook, I think, the illuminated cook, Brother Lawrence.
I think it was Brother Lawrence, yeah.
And they were pointing out that it's wonderful to be, and not really, it's awfully difficult, to be standing in the kitchen snapping beans or something or other, and being able to just kind of work that into this wonderful rhythmic sort of om chanting thing. And try doing that while negotiating a business deal, and it's an entirely different process, and one which is not likely to work well on either side. And you must bring a different kind of concentration altogether to a process like negotiation, as opposed to a process like preparing a meeting.
Well, the trick, though, in both cases is to maintain a bicameral awareness, to be aware on both sides, so that you're sitting there. It's the old in the world but not of it thing. It's that you're sitting there and you're negotiating with the best of them, you're absolutely vicious, but inside you're just kind of humming along with the cosmos and you're aware of what's happening around you, not just in the sense of your goal at a particular moment, but just in the cosmic sense. One of the beauties of all this is that it's a question of attention expansion. At any moment, you have limitless opportunities to experience the enlightened state of mind if you're living a balanced life. Reason. The elements of a mandala are around you all the time. I've often suggested to people, for example, who are extremely annoyed by the noise in the city, to try a very simple mandala experiment, which is this. If you've got a gardener who comes around Wednesday mornings and has one of those blowing machines and knocks you out of bed because it's so loud, when you get irritated, catch yourself, calm down, and then listen for all the noises. And listen to how they make music. Don't just focus on the blowing machine. Focus on a car rushing past, on what you can hear of the birds. Focus on any noises in the house, and try and hear even the most delicate ones. You'll be surprised how many of them remain in your hearing span despite the loudness outside. And get them all together into a kind of symphony. Get them all nicely balanced. And boom, all of a sudden you have a kind of mystical experience. Sometimes, not all the time. You can do this all the time, though. Try it at least. The only time that I don't suggest it is when you're driving. And that's because not so much that you couldn't drive in that state of mind, but getting into that state of mind, unless you're awfully good at slipping in and out, can be distracting. And you can find yourself feeling real good as you crash into somebody's VW. So it's best to keep it at least until you're real sure of yourself. It's also interesting, I might add, that you don't see a lot of Zen masters driving around. Usually they're driven. In fact, Manly Hall doesn't even drive around. And I sometimes, although his wife does, and if you know his wife, she's about as Zen as they get.
Shopping centers are good for that too.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's
Yeah.
constant hum and constant movement
And the colors.
Colors and shapes and all sorts of things. And you can just kind of make it like into a giant sand painting or something.
Exactly. That's it. It's sort of experiencing the completeness or the perfection around you at any given instant. And a lot of the secret here is very simple, and that is that you're being drawn away from past and future. Most of us live a great deal of our lives in the past or the future. Either we're thinking back to a triumph or some miserable thing that happened or a blown opportunity or something like that, and we're in the shower and we're thinking about that, and we're outside in the kitchen and we're thinking of that, and we're driving and we're thinking that, or we're thinking about what we're going to do when we get where we're going. We think about what plans we have. We think about the brilliant things we're going to achieve, or we worry about what's going to happen next. We worry about balancing the checkbook and where the next dollar is going to come from and all this stuff. And we do everything but fix our consciousness where we are at any given moment. The most extreme and maybe best example of this is, again, in Zen. During the World War, there was a very interesting observation made by Japanese psychologists, and that was that some of the Chinese practitioners of Zen who were tortured, well, all of them were unbreakable. And the reason was quite simple. They only felt the pain at the instant there was pain. The minute the pain stopped, the minute that the torture device was removed, they didn't feel pain anymore. They didn't anticipate, they didn't remember. They kind of went, and as a result, they were more out of pain than in pain. And, of course, as a result, they couldn't be broken. There was no buildup of tension. An experiment was done later to prove that, and it did, where in Japan they had some Zen priests and some, again, quote, average people, and they had a series of clicks within headphones, and they measured out the attention. And what you got in normal people was click, 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 until they weren't even hearing them at all. And what you got with these Zen priests was click, 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 click. Each click was like it was brand new, like they'd never heard it before. That's the key. I'm going to close up with that image then. The Kabbalah is only useful insofar as it can remind you to go from the feet of clay up to the gold. There's another thing that we'll discuss later called the klipoth, or the world of shells, which is the world you wind up in when you're off balance, and I think it's pretty much explicable in terms of the name. You wind up in a world of shells, where everything seems empty, where everything's kind of hollow and rigid. And if you balance using this system, or whatever other system you find comfortable, this one is very handy, you have the enlightenment experience, and what that is being awake. It's being truly human. Almost nobody is awake because it's never demanded from us to be awake. We learn to go to sleep in school immediately. That's the only way you can get through when you first start out. You're used to all this playing around, doing whatever you want, and experiencing the world playfully, and next thing you know, rigid order. And most kids deal with that by going on automatic. They just kind of sit there and they hardly hear what's going on, but they learn to get done what they have to get done, and we never unlearn it. So Kabbalah is a process of waking up. That's what mysticism and metaphysics are all about. And the easiest way to do it is to wake up. To really pay attention to where you are at any given moment. Because all the doctrine you need, all the teaching, all the wisdom, and all the advice is around you every instant if you can see it. The only way you can learn to see it is to practice seeing it. It's like practicing the piano. First it's a real pain, but eventually it becomes the most beautiful skill. So practice the piano of life, and if you need another refresher course, I'll be here next Tuesday, at which time Art and I will share the lecture. He will give one half and I'll give the other, so that you can kind of use us together to get a perspective, a third middle perspective. Thank you.